Look, I make a huge distinction in my mind between cryptocurrencies and digital currencies. In other words, I remain fundamentally skeptical about whether things like Bitcoin mean anything in the long run. You know, in a funny sort of way, I kind of think of Bitcoin as a bit like COVID. It's a lab experiment that got out of control.
Welcome to Long Story Short, where we explore how the world of money is changing through technology, markets, and new forms of capital. In this episode, we're joined by David Birch, author and a leading authority on digital identity, payments, and the blockchain. Joining us from the UK, Dave discusses his book, Before Babylon, Beyond Bitcoin, the long arc of money's evolution, and why we may now be witnessing its latest chapter. We hope you enjoy the conversation, and if you do, please subscribe to be notified about our future episodes. Before we sort of get into the questions and your kind of motivations for writing the book, could you maybe just share a little bit with us your story, where you've been, where you've come from?
Well, as you know, Jess, I was a consultant for a very long time, and then I wrote a couple of books, which I flatter myself did okay. And that took me into the world of writing and speaking, which I still do and enjoy very much. It takes me all around the world. I'm on a couple of boards and advisory boards for different companies, and I have a couple of academic roles. And I want you to think of me as a writer, not as a consultant.
I do think of you as a writer, Dave. I think, not only that, you also had the blog.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what changed things for me, because Jane Addams, who was our marketing PR person at the time, said, after I'd written the first few blog pieces, she said, look, you can be really good at this. You don't have to write better than J.K. Rowling. You just have to write better than other fintech people, which is not such a high bar. And so she encouraged me to do the blog, and then that turned into the first book, and it goes on from there. And now I have a weekly LinkedIn newsletter and a weekly Substack, and I'm quite proud of them, to be honest.
I also have here that the Daily Telegraph calls you one of the world's leading experts on digital money, which is a fairly nice.
They did say that. That was very kind
accolade. Of them. Well, it's probably a good segue. I mean, you got into writing. You wrote the digital identity book, and then you went on to write Before Babylon, Beyond Bitcoin. What was the motivation for that book in particular? Because that was where you started to explore this world of digital currencies and Bitcoin.
Well, look, it's a bit of a stereotype to say this, but the motivation for writing a book for me was actually, with the first one, as with the last one, was because I really want to understand something. And I think I understand something about things, but if I really want to understand it, I need to write about it, and I need to use the writing process as a way of organizing my own thoughts about things and my own understanding, with the target of producing something that's not for specialists, so that other people can pick it up and understand it. And actually, I think with Before Babylon, Beyond Bitcoin, I also got lucky with the timing. I mean, part of success as an author is frankly timing. And there were a lot of people talking about, triggered by Bitcoin, of course, there were a lot of people talking about the history and future of money. And I'm not sure if it's a bit arrogant, but I'm not sure if they'd completely understood it or drawn the right lessons from it. And so I thought, I can help myself understand this by writing, and then that turned into the book, which did okay.
And if you were to sort of think back and obviously not entirely summarize, but talk to some of those key parts of the first part of the book that talks about the history of money, what were some of the things that stood out to you about how money had evolved and that therefore placed crypto as the next step in that journey?
Well, in a way, you could argue that crypto was continuing the sort of historical narrative around this, which is the history of money as kind of a settlement between the sovereign, the state, and the city, the resolution of the tension between control and enterprise, the link between the merchant classes and the ruling classes, or however you want to sort of phrase it like that. And broadly, that history has been a history of essentially decentralization and the distribution of power. So you could see how crypto fits into that. I think what I did say in the book, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but I did say in the book, look, Bitcoin is essentially an interesting experiment in this space, but it's actually not money. And so I was unconvinced about Bitcoin's ability to become the sort of next generation money, which I think that's been borne out by. And of course now people say crypto, which jumbles up a lot of different things, but in my head at least, there's a big difference between what you might think of as cryptocurrencies and digital currencies and digital assets, the world of stable coins and so on. So I think I was broadly right about that. Yeah.
Mm. I think you caution in the book in a few different places about being overly confident that a particular innovation is the winner takes all type mentality, because it is such a dynamic and evolving ongoing experiment. And sometimes the innovation comes from the least expected places and often not from the authorized innovators of the system. And I think to me that sort of speaks to why we all need to caution ourselves around assuming that Bitcoin is necessarily the
Well,
winner.
one thing I was very, and you'll remember this from your fintech days. I mean, one thing that I was very fascinated about because of Bitcoin was the ability of people to innovate on top of it. And I felt, having spent many years working with what you would regard as the traditional old, banks and Visa and MasterCard and Amex and so on. I was a bit jealous of the innovation that was going on, because you had this. I mean, I suppose it's a bit hackneyed, but the permissionless innovation that it allowed, which we didn't have in the sort of traditional finance sector. And I actually still think that that's part of the dynamic, and the ability of things like stable coins to possibly bring some of that innovation into the. I hate TradFi, but you know what I mean. It's like this is a way of bringing some of that innovation into the kind of more regulated, more organized markets. So, but it's these are still early days, relatively speaking, and it's still evolving in interesting directions.
That's very true. Maybe just on that point, you talk about in the book, I don't know if you remember this, but you talk about our current monetary system having a midlife crisis. What did you mean by that?
I thought that was a funny phrase. Yeah, no, I said, well, it's been around for 50. I mean, I think it's hilarious, but who knows? So, but the point was, our current monetary system is basically 50 years old. Was 50 years old when I was writing. So you had the sort of post World War II Bretton Woods settlement, and then post 1971 you had sort of Bretton Woods 2 and sort of the new monetary order. So 71 was when America stopped the redemption of gold, the redemption of dollars for gold. So I was sort of thinking, well, it's coming up to 50 years old. The history of these things is that you have kind of punctuated equilibrium. People are very conservative about money, so it takes quite a bit to change things. But when things change, they sometimes change quite quickly. So it was sort of a joke in that sense, but I meant it. We had money that was built for a different age, for that sort of post-industrial era, and it wasn't necessarily optimal. Well, clearly it hasn't been optimal for the sort of post-industrial age that we're in now, the sort of information economy, whatever you want to call it. So I thought, what's a midlife crisis? You go out and get a sports car. Maybe that's Bitcoin. It's not always the most appropriate thing to do. Doesn't always last, but it's an experiment. So that's where that metaphor came from.
I did like the metaphor. It's your gift, I think, for humanizing, technological sort of concepts. Just on that point, in the book, you use the reference to the Cutty Sark and how that was a faster sail ship when really the world was moving towards steamships, I believe. And it was sort of the last ditch effort of the old world to sort of keep reinventing on the old technology. But really, the world had moved on. Could you just talk a little bit about what you were getting at with that in terms of money?
Well, that's a word. I mean, I didn't invent that. That's economists talk about the Cutty-Sark effect and what they mean by that. The Cutty-Sark is an example of that. What they mean by that is that the arrival of a new technology can spur one last final gasp of it can push one last set of innovations in the old technologies. And so, you had the arrival of steamships. You had this push to get the fastest. The Cutty Sark was a tea clipper. It was built to get tea from India to England as quickly as possible. It ended up transporting wool from Australia, actually. But it was built after the first steamships had already started running. So the new technology was already in place. And I did think at the time, and I think, again, it's a reasonable analogy. You see some things going on with faster payments and Swift GPS and this kind of thing. And you sort of think, well, these are like the Cutty Sark. These are the sort of final pushes of the old infrastructure. But actually, you can kind of already see the new infrastructure beginning to form. And I've probably hardened my views on that over time because I think it's reasonably clear now that this whole kind of, to paraphrase McLuhan, the money is the message. And so this whole idea that you're going to start transferring value directly without clearing and settlement, and it's frankly just much cheaper. So there's an inevitability to it. So, I think that's another analogy that holds up quite well.
And stable coins, of course, weren't a feature of the cryptocurrency landscape when you wrote the book, I don't believe, back in 2017.
Well, in those days, stablecoin had its original meaning, which was, a coin, a coin whose value was algorithmically stabilized. So at the time that was being written, I mean, stable. It's like when people talk about hoovering instead of vacuum cleaners. It's like stablecoin has become the generic term for, but in those days it didn't mean stablecoin wasn't a generic term. It was a specific term. It meant algorithmically maintained. And at that time, it was very early days to know whether that could succeed or not. As we now know, it couldn't succeed. That's not to say people might not invent new ways of doing it in the future, but we all saw what happened with Terra Luna and stuff like that. So, so stable coin in the broader sense, meaning something that's actually pegged to some kind of external value, has taken over, and you can see exactly why. I think one thing I hadn't quite seen at the time, I wrote another book in 2020 called The Currency Cold War, where I've been thinking some more about this, the competition between currencies. And I think then I was beginning to see that actually a lot of the demand for where you saw people wanting to use Bitcoin. I mean, if you went to like a Bitcoin conference, people would quite often refer to Argentina or places like that as, as existence proofs that Bitcoin was necessary. But of course, what we can now see is what people in Argentina actually wanted was dollars. And insofar as they were interested in Bitcoin, it was as a proxy for dollars. And stable coins deliver them the dollars directly. So in most of the world, most of the time, what people actually wanted wasn't cryptocurrency, but dollars. And I think stable coins delivers on that for them.
So Dave, in the book, you talk about, needing a new mental model to really understand where money is going, not to use old mental models. If I'm coming to you at a conference and I'm saying, Dave, I think my mental model is wrong, what would you be saying to me to fix it?
Yeah, I mean, what I meant by this is that the way that money works now isn't a fundamental law of nature. It's a temporary set of institutional arrangements which didn't used to be like that and won't be like that in the future. And by the way, this isn't some sort of crazy technologist view. There's a very good book called The End of Alchemy by Mervyn King, who was a governor of the Bank of England. And he says in that book, there didn't used to be central banks and there probably won't be central banks in the future. So we mustn't mistake the way things work now for something fundamental. They're not. So how could those institutional arrangements change in the future to provide more efficient infrastructure that better serves a different kind of economy? Well, there's all sorts of different factors. The first thing is, that ending of clearing and settlement, the money is the message kind of thing. There are things like programmability, which we haven't really got to the bottom of or exploited where they might take us or what they might mean. I'm particularly curious about the issue of sort of money in the composability side of things and allowing people to build. But I would say probably the biggest thing, and actually this is probably the biggest change in my thinking since the book was originally written, is that I've come round to thinking, and again I stress I'm not alone in this. I've come round to thinking that actually the main users of payments in the future probably won't be people. And I think this is a crucial change in the thinking. Most payments are going to be handled by AIs. And the way that AIs will want to access payments infrastructure and use different kinds of payment infrastructure is intellectually very interesting. I think we don't quite know the answer to that. I wrote a couple of papers last year. I wrote a paper about AI to AI payments with my good friend Debbie Gamble, who's head of strategy at Interac, where we explored some of these issues. And I think we can see some of the problems arising, but quite how it's going to work out, I think, is not clear at the moment. I think a factor to bear in mind, Jess, is that we're interested in money and payments, and we spend a lot of time thinking about it. But actually, normal people aren't. I mean, most people don't care about any of this stuff. If you walked out of Woolies and your phone said, "Oh, you owe them $27.12. Do you want me to go ahead and pay it?" You'd just say yes. Would you care whether it was going to do it via 8583 pull or a 222 push or, a stable coin transfer or, loyalty points? I just don't think you'd care that much. And so it's the sort of thing where you can imagine AIs and also, AI to AI payments themselves, because AIs will need to pay other AIs in the future. We talk rather lazily about, you have an AI that goes and does your shopping for you or, whatever. But actually what we're really talking about is networks of AIs working together to achieve goals for people. And somehow they need to allocate and distribute resources. And in a modern economy, that means money and payments. In fact, it means probably lots more payments than we have now. Anyway, so the point is, why did I say that? Well, because the institutional arrangements we have now are temporary. It didn't used to be like that, won't be like that in the future.
No, I like that. And I think just on your example of people don't care, you're right. I don't think they care at all. I think one thing I notice it's a difference though is if I interact with PayPal or I interact with Adyen or a Tyro terminal if I'm in Australia, or I use a Visa card or a MasterCard, I don't have any idea how the infrastructure behind those platforms works, and I don't care, but I know that they provide a useful utility for me in the real world. And I think when people look at cryptocurrency...
Well, also crucially, Jess, that they're regulated. That if something goes wrong, something will get done about it, which in the case of crypto, you don't know.
Exactly that. And also I think when people come to, when you ask someone, well, have you invested in crypto or do you have any allocation to it? They'll often say, I haven't because I don't understand it. And I think that's because they've never used it. It's never become a tangible thing that they've used in real life. So, if you ask them, how does PayPal work? They probably couldn't really explain that to you either, but it feels more real to them. And I think just building on that mental model that you described, and also that sort of point you made it earlier in the conversation about, money is evolving towards more and more decentralization. If I then followed up that question at a conference to you and said, well, how should I think about cryptocurrency? Give me the Dave Birch framework for thinking about that so that I can understand it, so that next time I buy some Bitcoin or I buy some Ethereum, I sort of feel like I know what I'm doing. I'm not asking you for investment advice, but just what's the mental model I should use?
Well, if you asked me for investment advice, you need to be sectioned under the Mental Health Act, frankly. Look, I make a huge distinction in my mind between cryptocurrencies and digital currencies. In other words,
Mm.
I remain fundamentally skeptical about whether things like Bitcoin mean anything in the long run. You know, in a funny sort of way, I kind of think of Bitcoin as a bit like COVID. It's a lab experiment that got out of control. Um, it was a
Oh,
very
that's
clever
brilliant.
way. Well, but the
That's
original
good.
paper, which we were all very excited by, said, a peer-to-peer electronic cash. It is virtually never used for that. Statistically, it's used as a speculative asset. And the reason why I don't trade on cryptocurrencies is because that the people the other side of those trades are armed with armies of AIs and bots, and you're basically just going to get your face ripped off. So it's not worth doing. Now,
Mm.
that's very different from the world of digital assets and digital currencies, where I think there'll be new ways of doing business which are based on the fact that you can transfer oil or gold or electricity or square feet of an office building or flights or whatever. The fact that you can take assets and transfer them instantly, securely, and safely to other people will lead to new kinds of business and new kinds of economic growth. So in my head, I still separate those things. I'm really not sure about cryptocurrency.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I would be in your camp as well. And I think what's sort of fascinating since you published the book is we've gone from a handful of these things to sort of more than 50 million. Some would argue that we're not too far away from a billion cryptocurrencies because of the ease of being able to create tokens and all the sort of then, you know.
Yeah, I'm not saying that doesn't itself have utility. You can imagine a situation in the future where you go back to that AI example, right? So one thing that AIs do, which will be very different from the way people do, is a lot of them will
Mm,
be ephemeral. You'll spin up an AI that needs to do something. That will spin up some other AIs that it needs to get to do things. Those AIs might decide they want a currency that's based on, I don't know, electricity or graphics chips or customers or something. I mean, whatever they value between them, and they'll spin up a cryptocurrency that's based on that, and then they'll use it, and then they'll get rid of it when they don't need it anymore. Like it's a very different world, and trying to imagine it in terms of how people used clay tablets in Babylon or gold pieces or Kublai Khan's paper money. I don't think that's helpful. I mean, it's useful in terms of like helping it to locate in the narrative, but I really think the way money is going to work in the future is just going to be very different than it is now. And one potential future, and again, this probably sounds lunatic, but I can assure you I'm not the only person that thinks this. One possibility is that money as we know it now might simply vanish because you don't need it anymore. In other words, if you can trade assets directly, the things that you want, why trade money that you're going to use to buy electricity when you can just trade the electricity?
mm,
It's that kind of thinking which says, well, hold on, in that case, wouldn't you keep all of your value, all of your wealth in investable assets continuously? Why would you ever take it out of those assets and put it into money purely as a means of exchange? And I'm very persuaded by that line of thinking as well. So I not only do I think that the future of money is going to be different, I think it's possibly going to be more radically different than people think. You know.
that's super fascinating. I think, yeah, you think about why we do this conversion process now. It's just because we don't have the ease of being able to trade assets like electricity, for example. But why shouldn't we just be able to do that in the future?
Yeah, yeah. That's and from your history in the super, you must kind of think at some point, why am I saving money that has an uncertain value so that I can use it to buy electricity when I retire,
Mm,
when I could just put the electricity in my super account instead? And it's again, it's that sort of thinking which I think may not itself be correct, but it kind of opens up this fact that things are going to be very different, and that does fascinate me. It still fascinates me
mm,
now.
mm. Yeah, that's very that could be a book.
Maybe.
So that probably leads us to the final question. A nice segue. if you were to go back, sort of, we're roughly 10 years on, not quite, but nearly 10 years on from the book. You've got the benefit of hindsight, which is always 2020. If you were adding another chapter to the book today, would that be what you would talk about? Is there something you would?
Oh, it would
want to
definitely be
add?
about AI. Yeah. It would definitely be about AI. And the thought has crossed my mind that it might be really interesting to write a book about how payment. Well, actually, not just how payments develop in an age of AI, but how payments and identity do it, because those are both my obsessions. So thinking about how money and identity might both evolve in an era of AI, I think that is a very interesting topic. So yeah, we'll see.
Well, thank you so much, Dave. I really appreciate it. It's been a
It's always
very
lovely
interesting conversation.
Thanks for the interesting questions. You make me think. I appreciate that.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Long Story Short. If you'd like to pick up Before Babylon Beyond Bitcoin, it's available on Amazon in both Kindle and hard copy. And if you'd like to connect with Dave and keep up with his latest thinking on the future of money, digital identity, blockchain, and payments, be sure to check out his Substack or sign up for his newsletter on LinkedIn. Take care, and we'll see you next time.